We're big believers in the community housing sector. If you look at other countries, social and community housing is provided by a mixture of central government, the state, but also local community housing associations or local charities or non-profit institutions. In New Zealand, most of our social housing and community housing is provided by Kāinga Ora, which is a government-owned near monopoly. And one of the things the last national government put in place was a funding framework to allow the community sector to grow. And that's why you've seen a lot of community housing providers spring up in the last few years and obtain access to government rental support called the income related rent subsidy, for example. And that has proven really successful. And community housing providers tend to be more nimble, they tend to be more agile. You think of a group like the Salvation Army, for example, provide excellent wraparound pastoral care for people they're looking after. And there's a whole swathe of community housing providers around the country who do a great job. Some of them limited to particular communities, others of them more nationwide. So we want to put in place that funding framework and continue that funding framework to allow them to grow. Well, about a third of New Zealand households are renters, and we need a functional private rental market. And in particular, we need rents to be more affordable. They've risen by $175 on average around the country. In my area, Lower Hutt, for example, they're actually up by $225. But nationwide, it's $175 a week. So we need downward pressure on rents because, and not a lot of people understand this, the big driver of the wait list for social housing is driven by rents. The way in which you qualify for the social housing register is by not being able to afford the private rental market. And so getting rents under control is a way of making sure that fewer people need social and community housing. So what we want to do is make more landlords enter the market. We do actually need a functional private rental market. And so we are promoting a range of changes to encourage more landlords to offer rentals into the marketplace. One of them is going back to what the law was two years ago, which is essentially landlords can give 90 days notice to end a termination, to terminate a tenancy. The reason we want to do that is to encourage more landlords to offer rentals. And in particular, the feedback I've had from many people working at the front line of people who are homeless and people who are in vulnerable housing situations is that landlords, if they don't have that ability to exit a tenancy after 90 days, they just won't take the risk of taking on a tenancy for someone who's left prison, for example, or someone who's got a bad credit history, or someone who's got a bad tenancy history, for example. Maybe they've been kicked out of some of their flats or rentals in the past. Landlords will just say, it's too hard. I can't take the risk. It's my property. If it doesn't work out, it's very, very difficult to end that tenancy. Once you've got the 90-day rule in place, the landlord can say, well, I'm going to take a chance on this tenant who maybe it's a bit risky, because if it doesn't work out, at least I've got that backstop in the law. And that comes directly from people working at the front line of our social housing crisis in this country. So not everyone agrees with me, but I see it as a progressive move that I think will encourage more landlords to take a chance on people who would otherwise miss out on the rental market. And you've got to remember, life is very difficult for prisoners leaving prison. You know, they struggle to get into rentals, they struggle to get into housing. And, you know, frankly, the best thing we can do for prisoners leaving prison is get them into a house and get some wraparound support around them, because that makes them far less likely to reoffend. At the moment, well, we do a shocking job as a country of looking after prisoners leaving prison. We do a shocking job. I met a guy. I'll tell you a story. I ran into a guy in the street. Actually, Nicola Willis, who's our deputy leader, was with me. This was in central Wellington. He'd just been let out of Rimataka prison. He jumped on the train. He had $5 in his wallet. I don't think he had any ID. He came straight up to us because he recognised us from TV or the paper or whatever, and he said, I've got nowhere to go, I've got nowhere to sleep tonight, what do I do? And we gave him the number of the Downtown City Ministry in Wellington and gave him directions, and I rang the chief executive and said, you know, this particular gentleman's coming to see you. I ran back the next day, he never made it. And what are the odds that guy's back in prison? Pretty high, actually. Pretty high. And so a lot of the social problems in this country are caused by housing instability. They really are. And so we need more rentals, we need more social housing, we just need more housing generally, and that's what we're very focused on. Landlords don't kick out good tenants. You know, they just don't. I mean, yep, there'll be a few bad apples in any market, in any industry, but the vast swathe of landlords, if they've got good tenants who are paying the rent on time, looking after the property, they don't kick them out, because it's better to have your property tenanted and get the rent in than not. So yeah, every now and then you'll see a story about a terrible landlord, and I condemn terrible landlords. They're scum of the earth. But I think on balance, it's the right thing to do. Ultimately, what we need to do though is rebalance the tenancy market and rebalance the rental market in favour of tenants. And the way we ultimately do that is by building so much housing that tenants have a choice of landlord as opposed to landlords having a choice of tenants. From basically post-war, from World War II onwards, post-war 1945 up until essentially the mid-1970s, we built a lot of houses. Not all of it was particularly good quality. They're not the houses we would build in 2023, but building consents, resource consents, were the equivalent back then. We built a lot. Both the government built a lot, but there was also a big private sector housing growth. From the 1970s, that slows down, and from 1990 in particular, it's been very difficult to build. A big driver of that is the Resource Management Act. We fundamentally changed the way in which we plan our cities. It became a lot more time consuming and expensive to build houses, and we have artificially constrained the growth of our cities. So New Zealand is not a small country. We're the size of the United Kingdom. We're only 5 million people. We've plenty of land in this country. There's no shortage of land. We just don't use it properly. We don't let our cities grow. We don't do density in our cities particularly well, although to give the government some credit in the last few years, they have started to make changes around that, and I support that. But we also don't do greenfields particularly well. We just make it very hard for our cities to grow. The net effect of all of that is that we have the most unaffordable houses in the developed world. Average house in Auckland is $1 million. It's about 9 or 10 times average household median income. It does not have to be that way. We've got used to it, but it doesn't have to be like that. It's not healthy, and the fifth biggest bank in New Zealand is the bank of mum and dad. That's how young families and young Kiwis get into the housing market, is from borrowing from their parents. It's not great for them. It's not great for their parents. Certainly not great for family dynamics, for example, and it's not great for financial stability in the New Zealand banking system either. So it's not right. And ultimately, the way we do that is by freeing up land at the edges of our cities and also going up inside our cities and creating competitive urban land markets. It's a technical phrase, but the big driver of house price growth in the last 3 decades is how expensive land is. All of that is artificially created value. So, yep, there's a lot of people who've put a lot of money into, second homes, third homes, investors and things like that. They're able to make great returns on those houses and that land because the land is artificially driven up in value by government regulation. We can make our cities grow, and we can make councils expand our cities and stop land banking. There's a lot of people who, a lot of wealthy people who own land at the edges of our cities who are just waiting for the land to be rezoned, and then they can put houses on it and make a lot of money. So we can change some of those dynamics through different regulatory settings, and that's what we want to do. So the last National government introduced a law that said if you buy and sell a second property within 2 years, you pay essentially a capital gains tax on it, your marginal rate of tax. And that's what we want to take the law back to. That's currently been extended to a 10-year time frame, but we think if you buy and sell a property, you're doing it essentially for capital profit, for capital gain, and you should pay tax on that. That's what we think is a fair approach. A capital gains tax is not the panacea to our housing problems. Some people say it is, but Australia has a capital gains tax, for example. Their housing is just as expensive as ours. United Kingdom has a capital gains tax. Their housing is, in some respects, far more expensive than ours in some markets like London, for example. So it's not necessarily true that a capital gains tax makes housing cheaper, and there is some economic evidence that it gets imputed into rents and actually drives rents up. So we're not in favour of a capital gains tax in New Zealand. You've also got the issues around just jewellery count, family batches and cribs, second holiday homes, for example, KiwiSaver, financial savings vehicles for people's retirement. So there's a lot of fish hooks with capital gains taxes. We're not in favour of one. What we are in favour of is stopping people making huge amounts of money on second homes through artificially inflated land prices. I think they bring a number of advantages that Kāinga Ora, just because of its status as a government-owned agency, a massive, agency, runs about 65,000 houses. So the community housing sector, they tend to be more nimble, more agile, provide better wraparound support. The ratio, for example, just a simple metric, the ratio of tenancy managers to tenants tends to be lower. I think of the Salvation Army, for example, excellent pastoral care for people, and they're better able to integrate things like addiction support or mental health support or things like that. And often people in social housing tend to have other needs just beyond needing a place to rest their head at night. They tend to be better at that, and that's why they're such an important part of the housing mix in New Zealand. I want to be really clear that there'll always be a role for state-owned housing, and we're not proposing to disestablish Kāinga Ora or anything like that. There will always be a role, and there will always be a role for private sector rentals, by the way. All of these things are about balance, but we need growth across each segment of the housing market. Housing is, I believe, the most critical issue facing New Zealand, and it is a human right. A warm and dry home is fundamental to an individual's sense of well-being, a family's sense of well-being, but it's fundamental across every facet of society. If we can improve housing in New Zealand, we can make our economy more productive, we can increase productivity across our economy, which is the ultimate driver of wealth and prosperity. But most importantly, we can solve this immoral situation where families live in motels or boarding houses or hostels. We can make sure that families have a warm and dry home and provide for themselves and create their own conception of the good life. It is absolutely fundamental that we solve our housing crisis in New Zealand, and we're very focused on that.